about 5 minutes past the hour, so we can go ahead and get started. Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. It's so wonderful to see you all here, and we're really excited to speak with you today about English language learners in the Writing Center. So what we would like to do first is just introduce ourselves, talk a little bit about the purpose of this webinar, and then we'll provide a session, an overview of how we've structured the webinar to give you an idea of what you can expect. So I'll go ahead and get started. Hi everyone, my name is Molly Renscher, and I direct the Graduate Writing Center at University of the Pacific in Sacramento, California.
I'm Therese Tonis, and I direct the writing program at the University of Baltimore.
I'm Lisa Bell, and I've been involved with writing centers for almost 2 decades now. I'm president-elect of the Rocky Mountain Writing Center Association, and I'm teaching in the Department of Linguistics first year and helping them revise their first year writing course for multilingual writers, particularly international students.
Hey everybody, I'm Percival Guevara. I'm currently an ESL writing specialist at the University of California, Irvine.
Wonderful. And so for our webinar today, we want to offer a starting point for thinking about working with English language learners and multilingual writers in the Writing Center. But we also want to acknowledge that this work is incredibly complex, and we hope to dispel some myths, provide a framework, offer some training ideas and resources, and also leave you all hopefully with some core principles to adapt to your own context. So we're going to try to cover a lot of material, but just know that we'll only be scratching the surface here. So Lisa, do you want to provide an overview of the structure of the webinar?
Certainly. We're going to be starting with Therese Tonis. She's going to be talking about kind of myths that we have not only about multilingual writers, but also perhaps our interactions or tutors' interactions with multilingual writers. And then we'll be having, I'll be talking a little bit about Writing Center learning theories and things that really are fundamental to thinking about the way we are shaping our interactions between and helping facilitate learning between tutors and multilingual writers. And then Percival is going to be talking about tutor training and some core principles or ideas that can be of use there, maybe some models. Molly will be finishing off reminding us, kind of giving us a recap of some of the main concepts we want you to take away to move forward into your own context. And then we really want to open it up for discussion so that you can think through how you might apply these ideas and move forward in your own programs.
And if I could just add, the group chat is a great place to put comments and questions as the webinar is going forward, and when we start to talk about, discuss with you after our presentations. So I'd like to begin today with some myths about multilingual writers and how to tutor multilingual writers. And we do this because the lived reality of the majority of Writing Center personnel, at least in the US, continues to be monolingual. And we therefore need a critical awareness about the realities of multilingual writers and their needs in the Writing Center. So we're going to start with myths about multilingual writers. And the first one is that multilingual students are a uniform group. So ESL or ELL doesn't really do the vast diversity of multilingual students justice. And we note that there are at least 4 groups of multilingual students we may see in our writing centers. EFL students learned English as a foreign language in their school systems abroad, and they're usually in the US as visa students. They may come from places such as China and Saudi Arabia. World English students originate in countries that were colonized by Britain and the US. And those are places where English has some official status. And some examples are India, Nigeria, or the Philippines. And students may have been schooled in English and speak and write a local variety of English. And then we have some recent immigrants, perhaps from Central America or Syria, who may not have encountered English before in school and be really fresh to the language. And we have the Generation 1.5 students who are long-term US residents. And they were either born in the US or immigrated as young children. And by the time they reach college age, they've been through the US public school system. And some of them may be nearly monolingual in English by that time that they come to us. So myth 2 is that multilingual students are multiliterate. That is, they have literacy in a variety of languages. And the research has shown that truly literacy skills in one's first language can transfer to additional languages. So many multilinguals learn to both read and write in their first languages, but that's not always the case. We can't assume that that's the case. And this means that some multilingual students we encounter in the Writing Center are learning English and learning to read and write a language at the same time. And this places a tremendous strain on learning language and content simultaneously. So this situation is prevalent among some recent immigrants and among some Generation 1.5 students who have arrived more recently. A third myth is that most multilingual writing problems are caused by the writer's L1s, first languages. And this assumption holds that language learning relies on transfer or translation from the L1s to English. But this is only partly correct. Transfer may occur when the L1 and the L2 share the same categories, but transfer does not explain every learner error. So as language learning progresses, errors are less influenced by the first languages, and they become more similar across learners as they encounter the unique features of English. So the more advanced the language learner, typically the more likely the errors will be with vocabulary, not with basic grammar. Myth 4 about multilingual writers is that they make the same errors in language and vocabulary, and this myth is the converse of myth 3. And it is based on certain assumptions, such as all languages are essentially the same, or the assumption that all learner first languages are similar in that they differ from English, and the assumption that all language learners go through the same language learning stages. And although there are commonalities among languages, first language background, and developmental stages, it's really important to remember the reality that each learner's path is unique. Now we'll turn to 4 myths about tutoring multilingual writers. So what do we do in our writing centers? The first myth is that all multilingual writers should be tutored in the same way as monolingual writers. And this myth is frankly a cop-out, whether it takes the form of all tutoring is good tutoring, that is better than nothing, or one size fits all. So the point of Writing Center work is to individualize instruction. And what the research has shown is that the indirect, non-intrusive, minimalist practices, including Socratic questioning that we use with most of our writers, or monolingual writers at least, these are often unintelligible to multilingual writers and confusing. So direct communication is often more effective. So leading into the next myth, one thing that we can do is ask students questions to set the scene, the context, such as, how much reading have you done in English, or what's your strongest language for writing? So myth 2, all multilingual writers should be tutored in the same way. This is the opposite of myth 1, and it's equally incorrect. So students speaking and listening, reading and writing backgrounds differ. And if a person is a Generation 1.5 student, for example, he or she may speak English fluently yet struggle to write. And on the other hand, a visa student from Japan, for example, may write more fluently than he or she speaks. So the most important thing to do is to play to the student's strengths and use those in the tutoring session. Myth 3 is that tutoring is best done in English by native speaking tutors. And this is beyond a doubt the most pernicious tutoring myth. And I call this belief ignorance as expertise. So what I mean by that is that knowing English tacitly or naturally doesn't mean one can analyze and teach it. The one does not automatically follow the other. So in fact, multilinguals can often better explain grammar and vocabulary, other features of writing based on their own learning experiences. And if they want to share their first languages in the tutoring session, it can be really useful for rapport building and for instruction. And finally, myth 4 about tutoring multilingual writers is that they're concerned only with editing, and tutors should be able to answer their questions about grammar and vocabulary. And these assumptions are both incorrect. First of all, that multilingual writers do sometimes equate good writing with accurate writing. And that leads us to think that they have little concern for organization and logical development. But even though it's true that they want and they are concerned about lower order items, to deny them feedback on grammar and vocabulary is really unethical. We want to give them feedback about higher order concerns, and many of them want feedback about that. So many monolingual tutors can't explicitly teach English grammar and vocabulary, and that's to be understood. So other than saying this sounds right to me, sometimes there's not a whole lot that they can do. But one thing they can do is lead students to helpful resources for self-correction. One of my favorites is the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary. And all of that to say that imperfect feedback can still make an impact, but the more informed we are, the more impact we can make. So acknowledging we've entertained these myths and moving beyond them leads us to a place where we can understand foundations for writing center tutoring and learning, which is what Lisa Bell will engage us with next.
Great, thank you. And so it is important to think about, as we think about training tutors or how we want to facilitate learning in our writing centers, it's important to understand kind of foundations of writing center learning. If you think about learning in general, learning is not something that's done to students, but it's something that is interactive, and we see that on a daily basis in our writing centers. And so it harkens back to constructivist learning theory, which is just kind of the bigger capital T theory, and then from there social cultural and other theories might come out. Many of you have heard of Vygotsky and scaffolding. All of those will kind of fall under this constructivist learning theory, which basically just is the idea that we don't have knowledge internally within us. It's not naturally in the environment that we have to uncover, but it's through our interactions with others that we make meaning, that we construct knowledge. And we can see that throughout several fields, that tutoring, writing, learning, they're all considered social acts that you need to have more than one person engaged, and it's through that interaction that learning takes place. With that understanding that if there are interactions taking place, then it isn't just the passing of knowledge from one person to another, but in addition to cognitive aspects of our work, there are also affective or relational aspects. And that comes into play, I think, especially with multilingual writers who may come from different cultural contexts, different backgrounds, as well as tutors who are also coming from their own contexts and cultural backgrounds. And so many of those things come into play, and when Molly talked about this being complex work, that's part of the complexity that exists. The other idea is, I guess, with constructivist learning theory, there are a couple things I want to point out, two main principles. And the first is that learning under this model, learning is collaborative. And this is just kind of a list on this slide, but I think it's worth considering each of them individually. The idea that learning is interactive, and it's also multi-directional. It needs to be participatory. It's not just, everyone needs to participate to make this learning happen. It's experiential. We want them to be in the writing center and feel like they can practice in a low stakes environment. Language, writing, tutoring, it's all a a learning about those processes. And it's also responsive and adaptive. So we tried to tailor our work to the people that we are interacting with, not simply providing a cookie cutter approach. This becomes extremely important when we think about the roles of tutors. Often we think of them as the more knowledgeable peer providing information. But as Therese pointed out, tutors, especially monolingual tutors, may have kind of innate or implicit understanding of language, but not explicit understanding. And so they can actually be co-learners in the process of understanding language, language processes, as well as writing and writing processes that may be different from their own. And learning how to tutor and be responsive and responsible and respectful in their work as well. The second idea, well, and I guess this is kind of the core idea I want you to take away from this section of it being collaborative, is in tutor training, we shouldn't just be learning about multilingual writers. We want tutors to be learning with and from multilingual writers. That interaction should facilitate the learning that takes place. And the next concept is the idea that all learning involves context and boundaries. We're not learning if we're only interacting with things, concepts, people you're familiar with. And so learning takes place as we move across into new boundaries, new borders, new systems. And we see this as language and literacy are contextual. Oftentimes there's this myth that multilingual writers just want editing, but part of that stems from the systems they're coming from. Language learning systems where you learn vocabulary and then you move your vocabulary into a sentence moves to a paragraph, and then you write the paper, where a lot of rhetoric and composition takes an opposite approach, where we get all the ideas out and then we work to refine, and looking at vocabulary and sentence level language is really the last thing. So it's not that one approach is better than the other, it's just contextual work that we need to be aware of. Other contexts can simply be, maybe there are parts of speech that exist in English that may not exist or exist differently in a writer's first language. The other idea is that writing centers are boundary spaces. While most institutions of higher education tend to be kind of siloed into different systems, different disciplines, writing centers sit at the boundaries of multiple disciplines. And Percival, can you click to the next slide really quickly? We can look at that. So this is actually based on the work of Paul Matsuda and then Lucy Masu, who moved forward this idea of existing in boundary space. But this idea that writing centers do draw upon knowledge from composition studies or writing studies, as well as language, as well as learning and literacy. And so as we exist in kind of within all these border spaces, there's work to be done to help tutors help others navigate and negotiate and transfer among these borders. Can we go back to that slide? Thanks. So our work is boundary work. And so helping make transfer of information or knowledge more explicit, also critical self-reflection. What are the systems I work within? What are my assumptions about other systems? What do I know and what do I not know that I need to learn? All need to be taken into account. And as we work with multilingual writers, if we can advance, I think 2 slides, the main takeaway I'd like you to get from this idea of learning involves boundaries is that the problems are not located in individuals, but in the difficulty of moving among systems. Nancy Grimm reminded us of this, where we don't want to position training to be about how to fix interactions with people. It's more about learning how to move among systems, and tutors need to learn just as much as multilingual writers do. And there's always learning to take place even with administrators. And so these are important kind of foundational aspects of learning and writing centers that will help maybe inform this discussion.
Cool. So I'm going to be transitioning from a lot of what Therese and Lisa talked about into a little bit of the practical elements. So specifically the objectives for tutor education. And I wanted to just introduce first the idea that this is something that is not going to be comprehensive in any since that oftentimes tutor education is not even going to be good. You can't do it in 1 hour. You would probably ideally want a semester or a quarter. But that said, what I'm going to be introducing are objectives to keep in mind, so that from these objectives, you can sort of generate your own activities that are catered towards your context. So I've grouped these into 2 different slides. I'm gonna just pause so that you could take a look at everything in this first slide. The first way to think about this is that how you initiate the session is very much going to reflect on sort of the myths that Teresa mentioned, and the idea that Lisa was talking about, that students are navigating a system. So one of the first things to really keep in mind in your tutor education objectives are how you're helping tutors react more positively and productively. And the reason that this is important is that overall, it encourages a lot of choice and collaboration going forward into the session. So if you look at those 3 bullet points on the left, reacting positively, productively, learning about the student's context, being able to set goals, a lot of those probably already sound like things you're doing. In terms of thinking about the ways that these objectives become more flexible for the session for multilingual writers, is that oftentimes, to make a very concrete example, you might have somebody coming in and they might say, hey, can you check my grammar? And in those situations, maybe there is a bit of an inclination to say no. Maybe it's because of what we define the word grammar as. Other times, it might be somebody is just having a lot of experiences, or there's a lot of experiences in their tutoring center, so that those myths that Therese were mentioning really do sound like, okay, this is actually what happens. But all of that said, being able to train tutors to sort of push those aside and to start to think about, okay, what are all of the experiences that I don't know about? Really being able to maintain curiosity. There's a bunch of activities that we could talk about at the end, but to just give a few examples, some of this really just focuses on being curious. Part of it could be the reflective element that Lisa was mentioning. When you learned your own language, what were the processes that worked for you? Just so that you can get a sense of what are the spots that for students that perhaps they're going through, so that you can get a better sense of where can this session go. So this is where I want to spend a larger part of the time, which is identifying learning opportunities. So one of the things that I've noticed a lot is that whenever I talk with people who are wanting a little extra support for their instructors or for their tutors, I always feel like there's this sort of idea that people with a background in linguistics have a magic potion or magic bullet that can sort of solve all of their problems. And going back to that idea that I'm building a lot on what you're already doing, if we take the idea that writing is a process, language learning is also a process. And going back to what Lisa was saying, there's a lot of collaborative work that can make that process a lot smoother for the student. So, pausing because there's a lot of notifications coming up. So to give a quick example is that when a student is trying to, let's say, identify something in their sentence that, or they've received feedback that something is not, for whatever reason, not understandable for the instructor, could be the specific example of AWK, like awkward. With a tutor, the way that they could sort of build on that process that they've already got is, we've got processes for, okay, tell me about how you're understanding this assignment. We've got processes for saying, how did you construct this thesis? Similarly, if you have a sentence, figuring out what was the process that led you to write the sentence, and specifically for the tutor, being able to describe the way that they're making meaning. So to go back to that idea where I'd said that it feels like you need a large amount of linguistic knowledge, what I would recommend is really just having the base components of like, okay, what are the parts of speech that are most essential? For example, subject and verb. And then being able to describe a sentence in terms of how you're making meaning. Because the way that this could lead to choices is that when you're able to identify the moments where you're not being able to make meaning that matches what the student wants, from there, you're able to generate options of, here are the other ways that this meaning could be made, so that it doesn't feel like, oftentimes I hear from tutors that they feel like they're giving one answer. But as you're making meaning, if you're able to identify what are the different options, offering those options for students in that process, so that that system becomes a lot more manageable in the sense that, oh, it's not A or B, it's actually, here's all of my other options. So I'll give you a quick preview of what that might look like. So this goes to the idea of co-creating knowledge. So let's say that a student decides that they've got something happening with their verbs that they really want to work on. Being able to negotiate the goals for the session and say, okay, well, let's really work on this. So what you're seeing here is sort of the end result of a process that a student and a tutor has created together. So what happens is that it follows a process of, one, how do you define this? So we see that at the top. After they've defined it, finding some examples. The reason that this is a co-created process is that it's building from what the student knows using their own language, and then trying to figure out, now let's really lay out the steps that you're using. If these are the examples and this is your definition, how do you identify maybe the subjects? How do you identify the verbs? How do you identify what is letting you know, oh, I should use past or present? And then from there, it could be the student and the tutor together working with, what are the steps to add in that will make this work for you? But I do want to acknowledge that oftentimes there might be moments where the tutor just doesn't have that knowledge. So in addition to being able to have that sort of basic, just parts of speech, this is something that maybe you would start off with at the beginning of a tutor training session, but then have them build it out throughout the rest of the quarter or the rest of the semester, just with extra resources such as time. There might be moments where it very much is just maybe a gap in knowledge. So this is sort of what Therese was talking about. Just because you know a language doesn't necessarily mean you could explain it. But in these situations, being able to model what are ways to find resources. So for example, if we think about collocations, which are phrases that just appear together, we don't know why. It's just a frequent phrase that we hear very frequently. Other times, many times, it will appear as a verb followed by a preposition. So even if a tutor can't explain what it means or why it's that way, being able to point to resources of, here are ways that I would find phrases if, for example, I were writing a different genre. There's a lot of phrases I won't know, but here's how to fill in those gaps of vocabulary. Here's how to build in a little bit more familiarity. So really what I'm advocating is that being able to, as you train tutors, help them connect the idea of writing as a process and building in a little bit of flexibility for that process to be able to work with those who are acquiring a new language, those who are writing in a language that's a little bit less comfortable for them, so that it feels like as the tutoring progresses, they still have a lot of choice and it is still very much focused on this idea of process. So I'm going to turn it over to Molly.
Wonderful. Thanks, Percival. Okay. So my part of the presentation will highlight some of the foundational beliefs that we've discussed already in the webinar that guide our understanding of multilingual writers and our collaborations with multilingual writers. And then we'll open up the conversation for questions and continued discussion. So please feel free to use the chat feature as thoughts are coming to you, as questions are coming up, and we can engage in a conversation in 5 or 10 minutes about all of the questions you may have. So the first foundational belief that I'd like to talk about here is that our conversation has highlighted the fact that multilingual writers are incredibly diverse. They include international visa students, refugees, recent immigrants, Generation 1.5 students, permanent residents, as well as many others. Many of these writers have grown up speaking languages other than English at home, in their communities, and in schools. Some acquire or learn English at a very young age, and for many, English may be a third, fourth, or fifth language. Many multilingual writers are highly literate in their additional languages, while others have never learned to write in their additional languages. Multilingual writers include undergraduate students, graduate students, and visiting scholars, and thus they vary in their knowledge of the discourse and content of their respective disciplines. Given this diversity, Writing Center administrators and tutors should understand the multilingual writers at their particular institutions. Our conversation today highlighted that language and literacy are highly contextual, and recognizing differences and understanding their nature and implications for tutoring is the basis for working effectively with multilingual writers. Once we understand the multilingual writers at our institutions, we can develop instructional and administrative practices that are sensitive to their linguistic and cultural needs. Within these institutional contexts, if possible, learn about multilingual writers' writing, reading, and speaking habits in English and their additional languages, perceive strengths and weaknesses. This may include writers' confidence in writing skills, engagement with writing, and genres with which writers are most familiar. Learn about how writers compose in English and in their additional languages as well. Research shows that in English, multilingual writers may plan less, write with more difficulty, reread what they write less, and exhibit less ability to revise on the basis of what sounds right. But this may be more or less true given your particular population. Values and beliefs vary across all writers, but beliefs such as ownership of texts and ideas, student versus teacher roles, and writer and reader responsibility will impact how students shape their texts. Learn about multilingual writers' experiences in the Writing Center, and when possible, of course, involve multilingual writers in developing new Writing Center resources and events. When tutoring multilingual writers, develop core values around respect, empathy, and collaboration, and allow these values to underpin and guide our Writing Center work. Tutors should explicitly recognize multilingual writers as intelligent human beings and unique individuals with their own views, priorities, and experiences. We know that multilingual writers have numerous rhetorical resources shaped by their many languages, cultures, and institutions. And we want tutors who understand and can identify with culturally and linguistically diverse populations of writers, and thus effectively collaborate with multilingual writers, which involves becoming a co-learner. Lisa illustrated that writing, tutoring, and learning is social work. That is cognitive and affective relational work, and tutors and writers are collaborative co-learners with shared goals, but they must also be willing to model language learning when appropriate, as Percival discussed. We must also be willing to explore assumptions and biases, including the myths that Therese detailed. So we can't assume that multilingual writers possess certain knowledge, expect familiarity with rhetorical notions, such as reader-based writing and directness, linguistic notions, conventional notions, including citation practices, or composing processes. Tutors should also be aware that sensitive topics, such as criticism of authority, political beliefs, and personal experiences, are subject to differing levels of comfort among writers of different cultural and educational backgrounds. And these beliefs point to the fact that tutor education must draw knowledge from multiple fields. Tutoring requires an understanding of the cognitive, linguistic, cultural, social, and educational factors that distinguish multilingual writers, including their writing processes and texts. The Writing Center field is symbiotic, and tutor education requires us to draw knowledge from composition, education, TESOL, second language writing, and applied linguistics, among others, as Lisa's diagram so nicely illustrated. This means that tutors can never be experts in everything. They are expert outsiders, as Rebecca Nowacek and Brad Hughes explain in their chapter on threshold concepts, in which Lisa's conversation about boundaries so nicely highlighted. So in tutor education, we should prepare tutors to provide feedback on both higher order and lower order concerns, tailoring approaches and feedback for each writer. This involves asking writers questions in tutoring sessions, and I love Teresa's recommendation to play on students' strengths. I think we must also remember, as Percival highlighted, the importance of learning about each student's context and collaboratively setting agendas with appropriate goals for each session. Finally, I think we should affirm students' right to their own language and prepare tutors to engage in conversations about linguistic and functional varieties of English, known as World Englishes. Speaking and writing in English mean using certain varieties of language over others, and when tutors work with multilingual writers, they should be prepared to discuss how much deviation from dominant language forms readers will tolerate. There are a few useful principles on this slide that have really helped me think about this topic with my tutors. These principles come from Matsuda and Matsuda's article, World Englishes in the Teaching of Writing in TESOL Quarterly, and I think they're helpful. And finally, the last foundational belief I want to highlight is that we should hire multilingual tutors and consider tutoring in other languages than English. This goes without saying, but because multilingual writers have numerous rhetorical resources, they are often excellent writing tutors. Therese explained that multilingual writers can often better explain grammar and vocabulary based on their own learning experiences, and writing centers may also consider allowing tutors to collaborate with multilingual writers in additional languages. Shared L1s can be used for rapport building and instruction. So the final slide here, it is a link to a Google Doc of multilingual writing resources that Therese, Lisa, Percival, and I quickly developed to share some of our favorite articles, books, and websites. The Google Doc is editable. You can edit it, and so this is just one way we hope to continue the conversation that we started today, but if you think of others, please feel free to share them with us. So thank you all for participating, and I would love to open the conversation up to questions. I see the chat moving, so I'm going to go back over there.
A lot of good questions coming in, it seems. I might quickly hit the first one, if that's okay. The first one that came in was about how to deal with kind of explicit grammar instruction. I just finished a multi-year action research dissertation on this topic. And I can say that as tutors realize that they aren't experts in language, their confidence actually decreases quite a bit, which then affects the interactions that they're having within tutoring sessions and their ability to be confident in their work. And so in order to help facilitate learning and also to empower your tutors, having them learn some basic grammar and language concepts is actually a wonderful thing to do. And Percival, is there a way that we can pull up those slides again and just move? Maybe we can move really quickly to that slide that has Lunsford and Ferris and Hedgecock.
Yeah, sure. Give me 1 second.
Or you know what? I think, do you mind if I do it? Let's see.
Yeah, you could share as well.
Let me see if I can.
I'm reading through the comments.
Let me pull that up.
Yeah, heads up, once you share your screen, the chat disappears. And
Okay.
if a notification comes in, the screen sharing gets really weird.
Huh?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just move quickly to that slide, and I'll share that particular slide. I think might be helpful. Let's see. I actually want this one right here. Can you see this? This is actually, you may be familiar with Lunsford's kind of top 20 errors, but Dana Ferris, she took second language writers or multilingual writers in the California university system and looked at what their most common errors are. We often hire and help tutors understand these top 20 that Lunsford has noted. We don't always give them the tools to address or think through this other list. And so this is often a good place to start, is just say, hey, let's not worry about everything about grammar, but like Percival said, hey, let's understand sentence structure. Let's just understand a few basic things that can help us facilitate conversations and scaffolding and even maybe some instruction in these sessions. So that's on the slides that'll be available, but that's something to keep in mind. I hope that helped.
The next question was specifically addressed to me, but I believe that the rest of the panelists can also respond. the question is, you discussed how non-directed tutoring is not useful for multilingual writers. I've heard this but could use an example to help me. Does this mean modeling more? And yes, it does mean modeling more. I think it can be very, very helpful. But I think that the concept that many of us have in non-directive tutoring is that students actually know answers to questions. They just have to be prompted. And that often falls flat with multilingual writers, especially if we're asking them questions about language. You know, to assume that they know, I think one of my favorite examples from a transcript was, what's the adjective form of duration? And, you know, the student was just going, what's the adjective form of duration? You know, keep going in that regard. You know, when you're really asking someone to say something that they don't know. And I think we can do that about things like rhetorical structure as well as we can about language. And so I think it's often good to just simply, you know, provide an answer, you know, and move on to the next important thing. So that's what I mean by being more direct.
And I would add that sometimes it's useful. We often talk about a directive, non-directive kind of paradigm in writing centers, but I think this is helpful when we take a more horizontal approach and see how does that idea transfer into different fields? Do other fields talk about it? And I would suggest that's kind of a writing center paradigm that we work with. I would refer you to the work of Makowitz and Thompson, who identify instruction, scaffolding, and motivation. They talk about motivational scaffolding, but you'll find in education and in second language writing, really they're talking about instruction, scaffolding, and motivation. And it's really helpful for me to think through that, to say, what am I trying to give them instructions so we can further this conversation and build kind of foundation? Or am I engaging in interactive, more scaffolded kind of dynamics? And then the motivation speaks really to the relational part of the work, the affective part, that we know how much confidence and you know, validation really can make a difference in these interactions. So I'd suggest also thinking through that.
Yeah, there's two questions that I wanted to respond to sort of simultaneously. This is Jason's about how do you learn about multilingual writers? For example, do you do it during sessions? So there's multiple ways depending on your context. One of the first ways is just to sort of know the landscape of what your whether it's a campus or whatever your context is, to figure out who's on that campus, just to get a sense. I know sometimes people change context, and that's one of the first things that can be very helpful to learn about. Just a quick anecdote for myself. I used to work at UNC Chapel Hill, and I used to live in North Carolina as well, but then recently I moved back to SoCal, which is where I would say that I'm from. And if you think about sort of the myths that Teresa was mentioning, I was still seeing a lot of multilingual writers, but it was very different in the background of what they were bringing as their comfort level in writing and the way it would appear in sort of their speaking levels. So a lot of the times just starting with what's the campus landscape. And at our writing center, what we typically do is the intake form it doesn't give us a lot of information. We really put a lot of that at the beginning of the session. So that's sort of where I introduced in training that there's a lot of importance in taking the time to not just build rapport, but to get a sense of context from your student. And then I wanted to add on the part about Bree's question about now we're online. How do you do that when someone just sends you an email? You can't talk to them. Let me see if I could share image, but pretty much the idea here is that because you're not able to have that interaction, one of the things is being able to sort of see even if it's a sentence or a concern with multiple perspectives. So this is going to be a similar concept. It's way at the end. So one of the things that I like to do with tutors, if, for example, that they get a sentence, and maybe a student says, hey, can I work with grammar? Early on, I'll introduce this activity where I have tutors practice making their meaning. So what this is a bunch of garden path sentences, which are sentences that lead you in one direction, but maybe there's a twist ending to it. And these are all grammatically correct sentences. But people or tutors, what I want them to do is begin to be able to find, okay, where does your confusion begin? The correlation estimates predict growth. Like, there's multiple places that they would say, like, this part is wrong or this part is correct. And I think even Lisa had a slide as well, but they might start off by saying, okay, correlation, I get what that means. Estimates, oh, this must be the correlations are estimating something. But then they get to the word predict, and then they'll say, I'm confused here. So there's multiple ways to interpret this sentence. And generally what I want students to do, or want tutors to do, is not to be able to look at a sentence and immediately decide this is right or this is wrong. And instead say, there's maybe 4 entry points into this sentence that are going to lead to a revision. So in an online session, what I would do is, if it's just asynchronous, you're getting a paper, you're sending responses, using a part of a sentence or using the full sentence and really laying it out as a multiple choice of, there's maybe 4 ways that I could have interpreted this, or there's 4 ways that I could have responded to this, rather than just giving one. And then as students or as tutors get more expertise, they can start to be able to explain, here are why I would offer these possible revisions, or here's what they mean. Because adding that why is the learning opportunity for the student. It's what gives them a little bit more information so that in the future they could make better choices or more informed choices.
We're getting a lot of questions about online. And I think obviously that's a very valid topic right now. I think things to keep in mind with online is that although many faculty members or writing centers often prefer synchronous, they really can be challenging for multilingual writers and learners, language learners, because they get one chance to kind of absorb that information and then it's gone, right? Where asynchronous, you can pause a video and return to it. You can reread comments. There are a lot of things to keep in mind about linking people to resources. There are so many resources out there. If you're going to talk about an issue, maybe give them additional places they can go for information. I think those are key components. And also being very clear about in a session, in a tutoring session, you know, often we ask about what a writer's concerns are. What are writers' concerns and what do we hope to accomplish in this session really can be 2 different things. I want to look at grammar. I'm hoping to go through my whole paper during the session. Or I want to look at grammar, but it's really just this one paragraph and I have a pattern of having problems with commas. So really kind of narrowing down what a shared goal can be that's appropriate for the time that you're spending together would, I think, be a couple suggestions that I would have. What would you guys add?
Yeah, one of the things, and it is ultimately the student's choice. That doesn't necessarily mean that if a student says, I really want to work on grammar, that you instantly go with it. It is giving them a sense of like, if we work on this, here is what it would look like, and here are the benefits. So that they're making a bit of a more informed decision. Because students really do have a valid concern. I've met many students who will say like, I understand that the argument isn't there, but if I literally get 3 errors, I will get an F on this paper. It just doesn't feel fair for a student to focus on argument if it's going to get them an F. But at least they have an understanding that, okay, I understand that this process is maybe going to be a little bit shorter, but ultimately it's going to be more helpful. And then it is their understanding that, like, yes, there are higher order and lower order concerns, but it's still contextual.
I just want to quickly add there that I think think I completely agree with Lisa and Percival. I think I often try to gather as much information as I possibly can about the student's context before I start providing written feedback by email. Following good best practice for written feedback by email, but then also just trying to gather as much information from the student as possible about their particular needs at that moment in time, and really trying to help them where they are. I also wanted to just quickly jump in and respond to Jason, your question about how do you learn about multilingual writers. If you are interested in chatting more about surveys, I'd be happy to talk about that. I have developed a couple institutional surveys for multilingual writers, also within our specific writing center, to gather more information about their experiences in the writing center, and lots of other things too. So if you want to share ideas, please feel free to share your email address, and I'd be happy to reach out to you and share the surveys I've developed and talk about that more. I'd love to learn from you as well.
I would say also, in addition to doing your own surveys and assessment work, there are often offices or individuals on campus whose whole job it is to understand the demographics of your student population. And sometimes reaching out to them, or even if you have a department that deals with second language writing or multilingual writers more closely. The other thing that was extremely eye-opening in our writing center we did a couple falls ago is we had some focus groups with our multilingual writers, and just let them talk about what works and what wasn't working. And it was extremely eye-opening, and it helped shape some of the policies and procedures as well as the training that we were doing.
There were two questions that Graciela had asked. One of them was about whether or not, or do we suggest offering support about linguistic aspects at sense level? And actually, it's possible, Graciela. Would you like to just sort of elaborate on the question? The second one's a little bit longer. I can unmute you if you'd like.
Johan, I give you again the question. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Ah, excellent. Okay. Sometimes the students have questions about, well, they receive some feedback online, but sometimes the feedback is not explicitly saying what is wrong with the section that is apparently incorrect, for example. So sometimes we need to have more information about that. But also we know that it's not the work of our writing center to give completely the explanation about what is wrong, because we need that the writer thinks or reflects about his own writing. So could you give a little bit more information about how we can give feedback because the perception of how I read the text is my own perception, but the perception of the author is a different one. And maybe if another person reads the same text, they will find something that is not right. Okay, so could you give an example about how we can manage that situation when the writers expect to have clearly the information or how to manage that issue?
Yeah, thanks for that elaboration. And actually, Lisa, this reminds me of one of your slides. Do you mind if I pull it up? I think it was the one about broke versus broken.
Oh yeah, go for it.
I'm going to pull that up, and would you like to contextualize and explain that a little bit?
Sure. So one of the things that let's see, are you pulling up or should I grab it real quick?
I could pull it up.
Okay. So one of the activities that I would often do with our tutors in a training session is talk about some sentence level issues. And so I'd give them a sentence and say, what is wrong with this sentence? And technically there actually isn't anything wrong with this sentence, but the meaning is unclear. And so I think one thing that we need to do is help tutors in their conversations with writers, help them to be transparent when something is just confusing to them as a reader, or could be a stylistic choice versus actually being an error. If possible, that can be useful. But we'd have the students look and say, okay, this is actually an issue of an idiom. So helping the tutors know what maybe the name is at play. And so they know what we're looking at. And then the next thing I would suggest on the next slide is, instead of simply, this is how you fix it, helping them understand what resources would allow them to help find the information they need, and then help, use those resources with the writer they're working with. It's similar, I think, of, working with citation styles. I'm not going to expect you to memorize the Chicago handbook, but I want you to know 2 or 3 really good resources. The actual handbook itself, maybe Purdue, maybe a handout that's, from a specific department in, in your college, whatever the case is, but giving them some things to use as they work with students in these areas. Percival, is that kind of what you wanted me to speak to? Does that help?
Yeah, and I guess while this is open, so I totally get the idea that like oftentimes when a student is writing something and you don't have that opportunity to interact, you should not make too many assumptions about what you think they're meaning. And I'm just going to go back to this to give a quick sense of how do you respond and have it still be specific and not feel vague? Because there could be an instance of this sentence where a tutor just replies, "This is weird." And then they just sort of stop there, like revise. The way that I recommend people sort of give feedback in those situations, it goes back to what I was saying about sort of the entry points. And part of it does have to deal with being able to describe how you're making meaning. So I'll just illustrate it really quickly. The complex houses research. And I was talking with colleagues about this because they were like, there's no way you could have this sentence. It's a bad sentence. But before jumping to bad, going through the process of how you're making meaning. So the complex, okay, so that could be an adjective. It could be a description. Maybe we don't even need to use the word adjective. Or maybe in some places, people typically do that as the building that you're in. Then we get houses. It's like, okay, maybe you were looking at houses that have a lot of rooms. And then someone says research. They're like, wait a second. I have a noun or an idea, and now I'm missing an action in the sentence. So one of the ways that I transition from having tutors be able to point at where their confusion is happening, or the multiple places that their confusion is happening, is by giving them sort of 4 different reasons why that confusion is happening. One of it might be, I feel like I'm missing something. I feel like I'm missing an action in the sentence. Or it could be, I feel like I have too many of something. I have too many nouns and no action. So you sort of have your pick. And the other ones are more along the lines of like, it feels like something's in the wrong place here or in the wrong form. But the way that I have tutors begin to justify their confusion is that starting point, just as the like maybe the first couple of hours of their like tutor instruction before they really get to being able to describe it more linguistically. And then once they're able to describe it linguistically, then they can sort of point to the specific resources that Lisa was mentioning. One of them that I like to use is a phrase or a website, wordandphrase.info, where they could look up collocations. So that's the way I have students sort of point out more specifically what's the part of the sentence and why. And I give them those menu of errors that they could choose from, and then offer a resource after that, just so that the student has not one revision path, but several.
Can I add something to that? My experience, well, first, let me just say that my thesis was in grammar and how people learn grammar. And so when we're talking about grammar, we talk about a lot of different things. And when we're measuring grammar, we're measuring lots of different things also. But one of the things that I figured out, or I learned the hard way, I guess, is that most of our students are talking about, or most of our tutors are talking about a different thing than what our students are talking about, or our writers are talking about. And so our tutors are, when we're trying to tell our tutors, no, you don't have to talk about grammar to our native speakers, they're okay with that because they're thinking, oh, I already have this grammar in my head. They don't use that term. but Hartwell does. And so, you know, I already know how a sentence goes, and most of my writers know how sentences go. But when we're talking, and of course they take that, and just like any other person that you train or, you know, is learning, they compartmentalize that, and they're like, oh, well, I don't have to ever do that again. And they never, you know, I'll never do that again. And so when we move over to our second language, multi-language really, writers, that their grammar is much different than ours as far as how they're defining it, in general, just in a common sense. So they're really looking at what we would call school grammar, which is what our teachers measure. You know, what's the preposition, what's the verb, what's the noun, things like that. Because many of them, that's how they learn the language, through a formal setting. Not always, but for many of them. And for whatever reason, the way our system works in education, after our American students get through like 10th grade, well, actually before that, once they get into high school, they don't really have that grammar instruction anymore. And so whatever instruction that they had about subject, verb, and object, you know, the basic things that you and I talk about that we think, gosh, our freshmen should know this, they don't use that terminology anymore. So it just kind of leaks out of their head and kind of rolls out this ear over here. And so when we go to talk to them about how to talk to multi-language people about just the basic concept of subject, verb, object, we have to kind of remind them what that means. And they do know it because they use that, you know, that's how they communicate with each other and with us, but they don't remember, oh, that's subject, oh, that's verb, that's object. In actuality, most other languages don't use that method. We're really just one of the only ones that do. And so they don't, you know, other speakers don't realize that it goes in that order. And, you know, if you think about any of the other languages that you may have been exposed to, like Spanish or really any other language, you would know, you know, you can see how it just doesn't go in the same order. And so you can empower your tutor to empower the student, the writer, by simply just reminding him about things that he probably does know, but he probably hasn't used in a long time. You know, you kind of have to use your writing center hat, you know, and tutor your tutor so that he can be empowered to be more direct and to help your writer identify, you know, what's missing from the sentence. Like what Percival, what you were saying about things are missing. And like two of the things that you were talking about, that you gave them four options, you kind of gave them four options of how to explain it. Two of those are directly related to just the basic concept of subject, verb, object. And if your second language writer can at least communicate with subject, verb, object, most of your readers can understand what he's saying. Not all of them.
I'd like to respond to something that Elliot posted. He said, one challenge I have is helping ELLs do a thorough revision. Would sharing a model of a pre and post revision essay be helpful? I don't know if it's motivation or expectation. I think sharing models can be really helpful. I think, though, that for tutors, one of the most important things is to do, you know, a sort of triage of what is the most important thing, even when responding to, you know, sentence level grammar and vocabulary. You know, what are the repeated errors, if we want to call them errors? What are the repeated mistakes that are happening? Which one of these most impede understanding? There's actually been some research done on which errors in English are the most annoying to faculty. And the number one error that was the most annoying to faculty was article use, which of course is one of the most difficult things to explain. But, you know, spending some time on, you know, what things are going to make the most difference in the revision. I think is really important, as well as asking the student what they think is going to make the most difference in their revision.
There's a question a little further up. I can't remember the name. I think someone was, oh, here it is. Emily's question about how do we build up confidence in students who have internalized deficit thinking as multilingual students? So first, let's just take a moment to acknowledge that that's a thing. Yeah, so one of the ways, and I was going to pull up a slide. The way that I think about that sort of internalized deficit, it's very similar to the people who might come in and say that I'm a bad writer, or have similar thoughts that there's a standard that maybe you're born with or not born with, and if you are not born with it, you're sort of SOL. And starting to demystify or interrogate those ideas of like, what is a good writer? And going back to the idea of process, because at least what I've noticed with students is that a lack of feeling of what are my options, or the sense that all of the options that I take are bad, are what tend to lead students into this idea of like, I'm always going to be a bad writer, because if I take this choice, the writer's going to say that that's not, or the reader's going to say that's not great. If I take this choice, the reader's going to say that's not a great choice either. So really being able to figure out, okay, let's go through more specifically the steps that you're taking to even get to this sentence. And I think this is partially in response to like another question that was asked about what was the article that I was using. Let me see if I could pull it up. So this was the Catisel article that I pulled a slide from. And one of the ways that you can help multilingual writers feel a little bit more empowered in their choices is not necessarily showing them writing that they could never achieve. It would be by showing them their own writing and going through the steps of, here's how we're going to revise your own writing. So this is the example that I had shown. These are all different examples of students who had negotiated with their tutor, what would I like to improve? And that's sort of the first step. You can't just say, we're going to make you an awesome writer in 1 hour. We can help out one part of your writing that, as Therese mentioned, is maybe impeding meaning the most, or maybe it's not impeding meaning, it's an article usage. But there is still a system for that, and I could show you a resource for that as well right after this. But what helps the reader or the writers feel like they've got a little bit more confidence is that these sentences are coming from their own writing, and that you're working in a process that works with their own definition, that you help them modify. You don't immediately overwrite it. It's a work in progress. They'll have their definition. You could work with them to make it work better. How to form it? Start with their own way of forming it and then build onto it. Don't build over it. Don't overwrite it, because a lot of the times just that like intrinsic motivation of like, oh, this is someone else's process. Now I know for sure I can't do it because I always have to ask someone for that process, instead being able to build on it. So these were examples. I think I posted in the chat what the article name for this is. It comes from Catisel. And as far as like resources in terms of like how to even find something like articles, shout outs to UNC Chapel Hill because I used to work there, but also I really like that writing center. They do have resources along the lines of like, yeah, we recognize that it's very difficult to figure out what is, where should I put the, a, or nothing? So I'm going to share another page. So this is writingcenter.unc.edu. And then I click up here. This is what I would do with the student, except I would have them use the mouse. And then scroll down and then say like, okay, there's a bunch of things about the paper. But in terms of articles, the senior ESL specialist over there, Gigi Taylor, wrote this up in terms of, okay, there's a lot of information about what to know, but it still is a process. In fact, it's a flowchart even in terms of how do you figure out which one to choose. And it's not a matter of this one sounds right, this one doesn't sound right. You should know it's this one or you should not know. There's a process to follow. And actually, while I'm on this page, I think it's a little bit hard to see because the camera pictures are impeding it. In terms of opening up the session, there is another sort of useful guide, which is on our references page, of like how to respond with just check my grammar, in the sense that like sometimes a student really does want to ask about grammar. Other times the word grammar is maybe hiding the meaning of like, oh, they use the word grammar for everything. So those are just some of the ways to help build in a little bit more confidence for students as well.
I'd also add, going back to the idea of learning happens at boundaries or involves boundaries, your tutors do this every day, all day long in the Writing Center. When a biology major works with an art history major, when an undergrad works with a graduate student, this work of being an expert outsider and someone who's helping broker through different systems is what they do all day long. So helping them understand that this isn't different work. It may be just systems you're not as familiar with. I often will, and I'll pull this up, one of the first things that I will do with my students as let's see, whoops. Trying to share the screen, it's not working. Another thing that I sometimes share with students is this idea, can you see it now? Okay. Of differences in writing, the idea that the writing is contextual, and it does kind of change the dynamics of, you know, how they feel about their own writing. Oh, sorry, let's go up. Oh, let's go down. Wait, Percival, where did we put that? Well, I'll just stop sharing screen. I'll just mention this idea that I have them look at a piece of poetry and then scientific writing and say, which is better, right? It all depends on context. Sometimes writing tutors who are English majors and have grown up in that tradition, their mind is blown when they learn about IMRAD format and that 2/3 of the campus is familiar and writes in this format regularly, right? So I think it's the same idea. It's a little bit of an older resource, but coming out of Oregon State University, Writers Cross Boundaries, it's a video series you can find on their website, also on YouTube, but it has multilingual writers talking about their own understanding of writing as being contextual. And sometimes for tutors just to move beyond deficit to, instead of deficit thinking, contextually thinking about writing and writers, I think that's a good resource as well. But then you do have to not just help them realize the gaps in their own knowledge, but then give them tools to then move their knowledge up another level, and acknowledge that that won't always happen right away. So sometimes I would say the one-shot, one-and-done training to work with multilingual writers is never the way to go. This is something that should be sprinkled throughout all of your training as you have not only kind of the classes and conversations about these issues, but even as you do observations, as you encourage reflection and dialogue among tutors. I think these are ways to also build kind of community and confidence in this work. Hope that helps.
Yeah, to build on that idea of like community and different perspectives, and training, again, takes a long period of time, and you're going to want to scaffold it. You're not going to go with maybe the most complex ideas. You want to have a nice, smooth entry point for what your tutors are familiar with. So if this exists in your own context or your writing center, if you have people from different disciplines, or if you've got a mix of undergraduates and grads, it can be really fun to have them look at writing in each other's fields, because immediately they might decide like, oh, the way that you're using certain words are not the ways that I would use them. I remember when I was working at UNC Chapel Hill, we had a little bit of like anxiety from the undergraduates about getting feedback on grad level writing, because again, it was just sort of this idea that like, I'm not good enough for whatever reason. So instead we took that idea and we built on it. It's like, okay, well, what do you have? What can you use in your repertoire of making meaning so that you're still giving constructive feedback? And one of the activities that we had done was pretty much taken an abstract of grad level writing, and we had eliminated a lot of the jargon and kept the verbs. And then to give you a spoiler, we were leading up to the sentence structure idea. We were giving them a little bit of a indirect approach of how to help them see that verbs are important, not so much the crazy nouns. So we showed them a grad level writing where we had blacked out all of the very complex terms, and the students were still able to say, oh, I see what's happening in this sentence. Something is building on something. Something is indicating a gap. So that right there was a really quick way for them to be able to see like, oh, there's a part of the sentence that is very important. And starting there was one useful way to get them to transition like, okay, well, if that was grad level writing, let's just give you something that maybe is something that you would see in an English class that you've already taken, but now it's coming from a multilingual writer. So there, it's a little bit of a smoother transition in transferring the skills that they have of making meaning in the sentence to now just applying it to another situation. Because, you know, the way I remember very specifically, I was working with a computer science researcher, and I think he wrote the word greedy algorithms, which if you don't know computer science, you might be a little bit struck that say like, oh, in the heavily research-based piece of writing, you have the word greedy here. But when you learn about their context, like that's just the way that we would use it. So really going back to what Lisa was saying of like, okay, like it is a little bit of an exchange, but at the same time, if you don't have that exchange, being able to point to where the moment is and being able to justify why you're having a certain reaction.
Oh, I wanted to add something real quick. And my computer crashed a few minutes ago, so I lost all the chat. And when I came back, I only had like 2 sentences in the chat. So I don't know if y'all had already addressed it, but one of the things that I saw was that someone had asked, how do you help a multilingual writer feel more confident in his language or something like that? And when I was the director of the ELL program at Odessa and also at Sam Houston, I would talk a lot, obviously, to a lot of students who are multilingual, and many of them were probably didn't speak really great English. You know, that's why they were with us. But you know, one of the things that I really wanted to impress upon them is that they were very brave to come and to take the courses and to take time out of their very busy schedule and, you know, out of their lives to spend learning this language in another country. And also that in America, what they have is something pretty darn special, because most Americans only speak one language, and many of them don't do that very well. And it's very regional, it's very specific. And so the mere fact that they can communicate in 2 languages or more is amazing. This is not something to apologize for. This is something that is a gift that they really need to take with them and let it grow, because they have that gift that a majority of Americans just don't have. And that gives them a gift. That gives them more than anyone. You know, that's the special thing. There's nothing to be apologetic about.
Yeah, to build into that idea of gift, Francis, that's actually one of the activities I use at the very beginning of tutor training before we even get the language, is how do you see gifts in ambiguity, so that whenever there becomes a situation where the future is unsure, very much like what we're experiencing today, what are the ways that people can collaborate to create more choices that make it feel very much like these are opportunities that we're not just exploring yet. And like the training activity comes from improvisational theater, but there's a lot of different ways. But the idea is that, like, yeah, in ambiguity, there's actually gifts. It's not necessary. Like if you take the tutoring approach or take the tutoring session and see ambiguity as fear, I would imagine that tutors would find that very, very scary. And that's maybe like, I would imagine a lot of tutors taking it as like, I've never tutored before. There's too many possibilities. But one of the ideas of taking like, okay, what's in front of us, we can view these as gifts and opportunities. And the moment we collaborate, we get to something that we never thought of or scripted beforehand. And that's what makes it a little bit more fun. So yeah, I really enjoy that part of it.
So I want to encourage anyone else that if you have any other questions, we just have a few more minutes left. And so we would love to be able to respond to you either now or via email in the future. We will also be providing the link to this webinar and to the PowerPoint presentation. And then of course everyone's name is also on the on that worksheet that has all the details on it. So you'll be able to contact anyone if you have any questions that we haven't been able to answer, or if you have this epiphany moment and you want to you know, share that with the world, you can do that as well. We love to have new information all the time. We really appreciate you guys coming. Also, I believe our next session is like towards the end of this month. We have a tiny little break before we have the next one. We've been really, surprisingly, we've been offering webinars almost every single week, even through this unusual time. So it's been, I'm just surprised that everyone's been able to just keep on going, keep on trucking, but they have. You guys are real troopers all the way. If you have any other questions, please feel free to type them up quickly so that we can answer, or send them to us via email, okay? Thank you for coming.
I saw a question addressed to me. I guess people are free to leave whenever. It says from Harrison, Percival, do you have tutors actually practice improv theater to get that point across? In small elements. So I'll introduce activities that are inspired by improvisational theater. I won't necessarily tell them it's from that. So I'm also in a field called improvisational or applied improvisation, where we take principles and we apply those principles in other fields. So many people do it in consulting, maybe they do it in education like myself. So I'll, for the most part, modify things and then have them do it, but I won't tell them what they're doing because that might freak them out.
I think I saw, oh, I've lost it now, a message, I think from Graciela about using more than one language in a session. I would say those can be wonderful tools I think that if you can free up communication lines and facilitate learning that way, that's never a bad idea. With that said, if you really are wanting to practice the language, you will have to use the language you want to learn. So deciding how to balance that. Sometimes students need to know that the Writing Center is a place where it's a low stakes environment, where we're happy to practice and you know, and work through ideas together. It doesn't have to be perfect. And so sometimes getting that out of the way in order for language to just move more freely. But sometimes if you can't think of what you're going to say in English, if there is shared common ground, go for it. Go for it. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I like the idea that it's very much targeted to like what the goal is. So if you're having them write something that's ultimately going to be in English, if the Spanish or whatever other language facilitates that, and it doesn't lead to, I often see moments where people will have sessions in a language, but then they realize, oh wait, I actually don't know how to say this in the whatever I'm going to need to end up turning in. That's where, you know, just think a little bit more strategically about, all right, what are the ways that I could help this be constructive or useful for the session, and not just, it is great for rapport building as well.
Any other questions? We're so glad you all came.
Yes, thank you for coming, everyone.
Thank you all. That was really great.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you.
Unless you guys need the platform, I'm going to go ahead and end our meeting. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Francis.
Thanks, Francis.
Francis.
Sure.
Bye, all. Thanks.